Chris Matthews, and welcome to Hardball. It's a hot summer evening here in Washington, and we're coming to you from the Hardball Plaza in the heart of Washington. Our guest tonight, the Reverend Al Sharpton and author Christopher Hitchens, on the two things we're taught not to bring up in polite company: religion and politics. First, some big news today. The Senate killed President Bush's immigration plan. After months of deal-making and frustration, supporters fell 14 votes short of the 60 needed to keep the bill alive. The White House today moved closer to a constitutional showdown with Congress, rejecting their subpoena demands. But we begin tonight with the Reverend Al Sharpton and Christopher Hitchens, the author of God is Not Great. Christopher, you knew when you wrote this book, I will be glad to hold it up for pecuniary reasons. When you wrote this book with this title, you knew it was inflammatory because?
No, not a bit of it. It's a mild and furry title. It just says what everyone knows.
And what's that?
That God is man-made, and that was one of our biggest mistakes.
How so?
And that we've made a self-inflicted wound for ourselves. We've told ourselves we wouldn't have morality if it wasn't for a celestial dictator who can convict us of thought crime, who knows what we're thinking even when we're asleep, and who doesn't leave off with us even when we're dead. In North Korea, you have to praise and thank the Lord and his son all the time, incessantly, but at least you can die and get out of North Korea. Out of the religious and theocratic world, you can't escape. It's the origin of totalitarianism. It attacks our self-respect. It undermines our sexuality. It teaches us to disrespect women and to fear our reproductive
sexually?
What, I'm sorry?
Do you feel undermined sexually by God?
Not by God, no. I feel disgusted at the disgust that all monotheisms show for especially the sexuality of the female, and for the fear and guilt that they've inculcated in millions of children down the years, for the lives that have been ruined by shame and inflicted usually by unqualified elderly virgins.
Let me bring the Reverend Al Sharpton here in his unusual role of defender of decency. I'm just kidding, but obviously you've got to take a very establishment position here, Reverend. You usually are something of a critic and a protester. Here you have this man here offering the perhaps unsavory argument that there is no God.
Well, I think that Mr. Hitchens makes a very unusually effective attack on how religion is practiced. But from my readings of his book and our last discussion, he really has yet to establish what that has to do with the existence of God. I mean, you could assault the United States Constitution. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have government. God is not limited to the denominational practices or the hypocrisy, or for that matter, the obedience of how people practice a religion. God is force itself, and I think that his attacking of organized religion does not address the subject of that he raises, is God great? And to assume that God is reduced to whatever we think or not think he is to miss the point of what God is.
I've got a question from one of our email correspondents, Christopher. It's directed to you from John Fisher of Fort Smith, Arizona. Do you believe in absolute truth, the concept that there is a standard of right and wrong? If yes, where did this standard come from? If no, morals are relative. If that's the case, should criminals be even prosecuted?
Well, I'm not a relativist. It's Jesus of Nazareth who says you have to be without sin to cast the first stone. On that standard, we couldn't convict Charles Manson. If only non-sinners could be on juries, we'd be nowhere. On the other hand, the Old Testament says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Very barbaric. These are the two bad poles between which we have to, with our innate morality, our innate sense of what's right and wrong, decide these things. Is the questioner telling me that the people of Moses got all the way to Mount Sinai under the impression that murder and theft and perjury were okay, only to be told to their shock at that moment by God, that's not kosher after all? But of course not. They knew that already. Everybody knows except the psychopath. We hear the witty diversions of the question. The question is, what do you believe, Mr. Hitchens? And he gives us a tour of Jesus, Moses. I mean, we still has not said... I said God is man-made.
I didn't interrupt you,
But do you believe in absolute values?
The question was, do you believe in absolute values? And if not, then how do we prosecute criminals? We didn't ask you what Jesus did or Moses did. Again, he offers nothing. nothing but cute little critiques of little inconsistencies. Tell us then, how do we run society? Answer the question,
I began, I was just getting my trousers off, getting my throat cleared. I'm saying that religion doesn't help us decide this question.
But they didn't ask you about religion, they asked you about you. What do you believe in?
I will go on to say that I think our innate morality is good enough, that our understanding that children don't have to be taught the golden rule, that everybody knows in the society
insists. So you believe we should be governed by our innate morality?
There is no society ever found or analyzed or known of where murder, theft, perjury and the rest of it were considered to be okay. We don't need the heavenly permission. We don't need the fear of an almighty big brother or dictator to know this for ourselves. There are people who don't know it, psychopaths and sociopaths. They claim, the religious claim, these people are made in God's image too. That's a problem for them.
Of our prosecuting them, I think, was the question.
Yes.
If we're dealing with our only innate sense of morality, the question then is that for those that you call psychopaths, then how do we bring them in line when their innate morality says, that's not my morality?
Because
I mean, if everybody is innately in charge, then what is the basis of the absolute? That's the question.
That's easy. That's easy. You couldn't legislate the Ten Commandments because you couldn't prosecute someone for coveting his neighbor's cattle or wife. You couldn't do that, though it's considered to be a deadly sin.
Let me ask you a question. Let me jump ahead.
Let me jump ahead. I thought the Ten Commandments were mentioned. You couldn't prosecute, nobody prosecutes anyone any longer for adultery or for coveting another woman or man in their hearts. So you could not, in fact, have law that reflected religion. You've gotten to an interesting sweet spot here. Here's a comment made by Hillary Clinton just the other day at the AFSCME, the labor convention, about her need of a belief in God.
Look, I think that a science class should be about science. I think philosophy classes and history classes and social studies classes should be broad-ranging and looking at different points of view, because that's what the debate should be about. But in science, let's stick to science. I mean, one of the problems with the current administration is that they have confused us. I consider myself a person of faith, a religious person, and I don't see any conflict between believing in the power of the Almighty to have created this extraordinary world we're part of in ways that I can't possibly understand, and going to the museum and seeing a dinosaur.
Just recently, Hillary Clinton, who you just heard from in the audio, said that she needed her faith, her Christian faith, to get her through the embarrassment of her husband's behavior in the White House. Yeah. What do you make of that?
Well, so did her husband, if you remember. For the whole of that period, he would not appear without holding a Bible with the cross on the outside, so people didn't wonder what book it was. And he never went anywhere without Billy Graham and Jesse Jackson. He couldn't have got through without faith either. Shows how cheap it is. As for her saying the universe is more complicated than she can understand, that's right. Certainly it's more complicated than she can understand. Why does she say she has faith that God made it then? A nonsensical statement made by a senator from New York City. It shows how religion rots the mind.
Well, I think, again,
and the morals too. And the morals too.
To just have the subject matter on who and why and the politics of it does not address the issue. The forms the universe is in, the laws of nature, the fact that we're sitting here with gravity holding us down, we didn't decide that. And I think that I believe God did. I believe personally, unquestionably, unequivocally, that there's a God and a supreme being. And all of the cute talk from Mr. Hitchens still believes there's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So he's a man of faith. He believes in the unseen and the something that is impossible to still believe. He believes that. So he just has faith misguided. And I'm going to continue to work with Iraq.
With Iraq, you can actually use the argument from design, because a regime that had such weapons, that had gone to a great deal of trouble to conceal them, had a ministry of concealment, in fact, and that had used them several times, could decently be assumed to be still involved with them.
But it was not an assumption that it cost 4,000
why on earth? Why do you pretend? Why do you pretend?
Clinton and Billy Graham,
why do you pretend?
Which never happened, by the way. But you cannot.
What do you mean it never happened?
I did not see Billy Graham and Jesse Jackson tour anywhere with Bill Clinton. But again, neither did we see your weapons of mass destruction.
I rest my case. Anyone who looks up that period can see him with both of them all the time. But Why are you pretending you care about evidence when you've already said you just think that God made the law of gravity? You know nothing about either subject.
Well, then tell me how
you just to take it on faith.
You're the great intellect. Then tell me how we, in our own mind, was born and decided we'd hold ourselves down, Mr. Hitchens.
Don't be silly.
I'm asking you not to be silly.
Okay, all right. I meant that. Don't be so silly. You're claiming to know more than you can know.
No. I'm asking. You know, every time a question is posed to you, you go back and attack some other variable that has not been raised. I'm asking you, the mighty, brilliant Hitchens, who's never answered a question, tell us then what it is that you say brought all of this into being.
I put myself in the safekeeping of the audience in that case. I don't think I've dodged any of your questions. The atheist does not say that it can be proved that God does not exist. It said it cannot be proved that he does. So those who say that they know are claiming to know more than they possibly can. They not only claim to know he exists and was the creator,
what do you
more
say,
than they can know. They claim to know his mind.
The religious, you have the problem of talking to someone that has a recall. I asked you, since you attacked me saying God didn't make gravity, I asked you. I didn't ask you what the atheist said. I asked you then, how did we get gravity? You go through an analysis of the atheist. We're not talking about the atheist. We're talking about you, Mr. Hitchens. You attacked my statement that God made gravity. If he didn't, then who did? What did?
Don't tempt me by changing the subject.
No, I'm not trying to tempt you. I'm trying to get an answer from you.
Don't tempt me to change the subject from God to Hitchens. It's too much. I say I was in the middle of a careful sentence. The atheist does not say we know. They say we don't.
You're not the atheist. You're Christopher
we'll be
Hitchens.
right back.
Answer the question.
We'll be right back with the Reverend Al Sharpton and Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens' book is called God is Not Great. We're on the Hardball Plaza. Welcome back to Harball. We're outside here in the 95-degree heat, at least in Washington. It's not the heat, it's the humidity, as we say in Washington.
It's the stupidity, we say in Washington.
Well, we could say the mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the noonday sun, but we won't. Anyway, here at MSNBC, we want you to get your questions from MSNBC.com. We have some questions here for Reverend Al Sharpton and for Christopher Hitchens. This is for you, Christopher. It's from Glenn Horsewood. I think that's the way you pronounce it. Murray Hill, New Jersey. With regard to your stance on the Iraq War, surely you must find it curious that as an atheist intellectual, you share the same position as the most religious and arguably the most unlettered president of our time.
No, all it shows is that religion has nothing to say on these questions. I mean, the church of which the president is a member, the Methodist Church, was opposed to the war. The Catholic Church was opposed to the war. Almost all churches were opposed to it. Christianity has nothing to say either way. What you can say and must say is that Iraq is currently being reduced to barbarism by the parties of God, who are trying to do to Iraq and to each other, fellow Muslims, what they did to Afghanistan and Somalia. That's what happens when you let the parties of God have a free hand.
I think that what you just saw was the convenient way of maneuvering rhetorically around things. When Bush behaves in a way he approves, religion had nothing to do with it. But when people behaves in the way he disapproves, they were inspired by their religion. So I think you can't have it both ways. You can't say religion is behind everything, but this Bush is very religious, but religion had nothing to do with the fact that he made a decision that Mr. Hitchens happens to agree with, even though most of the world now knows that it is not a religious vision, but a personal hallucination that Mr. Bush and Mr. Hitchens had that led us into the war in Iraq.
Well, I've lived to see the Reverend Sharpton denounce rhetorical maneuvering, so that should be enough for me this evening.
And there's more to come if we can ever get you into eternal life.
When the president says that God or religion mandates a faith-based initiative, say, which I think is a violation of the Constitution, or when he insists on saying God bless America amid the collapsing scenery of his administration, or when he intervenes in the death of Terry Schiavo in the name of religious belief, then I think he is acting on that basis. The secular case for the removal of Saddam Hussein was complete long before any religious nutbag got involved in it.
According to, you can read through a lot of the president's texts and statements to find a religious coloration, we all know that, but according to two Palestinian people he met with, he said that he was on a mission of God to go to Afghanistan, and again, when he went to Iraq, it was also on a mission of God, a somewhat messianic notion. Do you deny that?
Axis of evil. What is that but a religious connotation? But of course, it doesn't help his argument.
Well, surely that would recommend it to you, Reverend, that someone would invoke the deity.
Your book or his axis of evils. I would recommend to you.
It's your problem, not mine.
I would recommend to you that if someone uses axis of evil, they are using a religious term. But that doesn't fit your argument, so you divorce that. It hurts book sales. The fact of the matter is that many people misuse religion. It has nothing to do with the reality of of God.
My book sales are quite unhurtable, and it's odd to me. The irony seems to be at your expense. You don't like people mentioning God.
No,
neither do I. But I thought you did.
God. You've mentioned religion. You've mentioned religious figures. You've not addressed God. That's my point. Your book says God is not great. You're talking about people that may or may not have misused their belief in God. You're not addressing God. I'm not here confusing denominations.
Let me let you into a secret. The majority of people who welcomed the overthrow of Saddam Hussein were Shia Muslims. I'm not a Shia Muslim, but I still think it's good to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Now do you understand? Do you begin to understand?
That has nothing to do with us addressing God. We're here talking about God.
You're the one who calls on God, Reverend. You make a living out of it. It's your job to do that.
No, I am living out of it. I'm not making a living. I am living out of it.
You're the guy who proves.
You're the guy who fuels my life. Of course.
You're the guy who proves.
Know the distinction.
You're the guy who proves. You're the guy who proves that you can get away with anything in this country.
No, I believe
if the word Reverend is in front of your name.
Well, let's get down to
if the word Reverend would get us immunized from everything, then none of us would have suffered everything from jail cells to other things.
It's time to make.
Tell it to someone who'll believe it.
Let's bring in the crowd here and see what they do believe. Christopher, you raised the question. How many in the room here in this outdoor place under God believe in God?
Agnostic count.
How many do not? The Hardball Plaza is like nowhere else on earth. As I've said before.
Don't you believe it? There's a change in the zeitgeist going on right now in this country. People are fed up with religious coercion,
let me ask you about
with lectures from religious bullies, with nonsense about the supernatural.
I accept that to this extent.
To stultify their children
the title of your book, Christopher, is God is Not Great.
Yes,
I believe that idiom comes from the Islamic religion, that God is great.
No, it doesn't.
Where does it come from? God is great.
Do you think God is great?
No, who uses the phrase God is great?
Again, he asked you a question.
God is great is the belief of those who think there is a God who
uses the phrase.
Where did the term come from? Let me help you.
I've never heard it in Christian liturgy.
We say it all the time. God is great. God is good all the time. All the time. God is
sure
good.
They do.
Okay, you do?
I figure I'd help him.
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah.
Do you think your biggest argument in raising this book at this time, you've come out and debunked and been an iconoclast with people like Princess Diana and Mother Teresa and people like that. You've been very tough on a lot of icons. But the icon of God is your biggest target so far, let's be honest. Is it because of 9/11 and because those people, those 19 people who were the hijackers that took the planes into the World Trade Centers, they were in fact screeching with almost orgiastic pleasure as they hit the buildings because they believed they were going to heaven. Is it that level of religious testimony that scares you, of belief?
Well, it certainly does scare me. They were the most faith-based people in the country at the time. Yes, I think that the term faith-based should earn less respect when we find out where it can lead us and where we realize that our main enemy is a faith-based one, the main enemy of civilization, in fact, whether it's Iran or the mad Jewish settlers on the West Bank who think they can bring on the Messiah by stealing other people's property, or the idiots in this country who want to teach creationism, stultifying children in school.
But the problem with that is, what about those that have their faith have made them do noble things, that their faith drove them
like
to
quitting
feed
drinking,
or to feed people, or to give medical care to people, or to liberate people enslaved? I mean, you can't use one example and act like all religious people or people of faith would be motivated to do.
It's part of the 12-step program for a lot of people.
That's a good point, but you have to answer my challenge then. You have to name an ethical statement made or an ethical action taken by a believer, say Dr. King, that couldn't have been made by a non-believer, like Bayard Rustin or A. Philip Randolph or the many black secularists who actually did organize the March on Washington, whereas many African-American religious people opposed it.
Okay, well, if I would be able to answer that, first of all, I have not said that people that are non-believers can't do great things. You are the one that's saying people that are believers are some idiots and so silly. I have respect for people not having that belief. Sure, Bayard Rustin did well, and so did Dr. King. And if Dr. King's motivation was religion and his belief in God, you are attacking that. I'm not attacking Mr. Rustin.
I think turn the other cheek and love thy enemy.
But whereas
we'll be right back with the Reverend Al Sharpton.
There are evil things
Christopher
only
Hitchens.
religion
Be back
can make
when we
you do.
return. We're out here at the plaza. Here at Hardball Plaza, which is a Hardball Plaza today. We got some questions from the audience for Christopher Hitchens and for the Reverend Al Sharpton. The first question. That's the question.
Question, Rick from College Park, and question for Reverend Sharpton. President Bush said in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq that God guided him in his decision to invade Iraq. When you look at the situation Iraq's in today, and the mess that it's in today, does that suggest that Bush was lying, or does it suggest that God does not really guide people when they say God
Well,
guides
I think that if you look in, if you're going to go use that as an example, the conflicts in the Bible, the pharaohs and the kings all believed their gods were leading them, and others believed their gods. So to have a distortion of a head of state in his faith and in what God was telling him is as old as governments themselves. I think Bush was misguided, not God being misguided. I don't think we should confuse the two.
Do you think all gods are the same? There's one God, everybody talks to the same person?
No, I think that there's one God. I don't think we're all talking to the same person.
Which people are talking to the right God?
Well, I think that the way I honestly believe, no jokes, is I think that you bear fruits. I think you look at the fruits of what happens and you see what happens. The problem is not all of us talking to different gods. The problem is different gods talking back. I think some of us have gods that are not the God and are based on some other kinds of things which are hooked to dogma and denomination, of in which I don't debate with Chris about. Some of them can be very evil. It doesn't make God non-existent.
Why did God make your hit list so recently, Christopher? I mean, you went after Princess Diana, as I said. You've gone after Mother Teresa, a lot of icons in history.
He's building his way up.
Why did you decide on God at your age now to go after?
Well, a lot of the original arguments were against the way in which people make things to worship. As you say, icon. The biggest icon, the most mistaken one they make, is the idea of a deity, and actually the Reverend Sharpton's accidentally helped me out in his last answer. We make so many of them, it absolutely proves that God did not make man, but men made God. The religious universe looks exactly as it would look if a mammal species made a god for each one of itself, and then went to war about which one was the right one.
Why does everybody make this?
Hugely retarding civilization.
Why do millions and millions of people, hundreds of millions, billions of people make the same mistake you don't?
Because they're afraid of death, and because they've made a false offer that an exception might be made in their own case if they make the right propitiations. It's a hucksterish offer, but it gets made. And because people look at astrological charts and they think, well, maybe the stars are arranged with me in mind. And so the religious tell them, you're a worm and a clot of blood and a piece of dust, but the universe is designed with you in mind. It appeals to the worst in us.
We'll be back
with
a pile of dust named Christopher Hitchens and the Reverend Al Sharpton. We'll be right back from Harball Plaza. It's going to be wild. We're back here on the Hardball Plaza with the Reverend Al Sharpton and Christopher Hitchens, whose newest book is God is Not Great. Let's go to the next question.
Thank you. Zach Mason from Miami, Florida. In particular, this question is for Chris. One of the big problems in the 21st century for the American people is that issue of fear. Now, when you're sitting at a table, I believe in God, all right? And there are many people who are atheists who are my friends. I forget the pun, can break bread with them. But the issue here today is why, if you're going to make policy in the Middle East, one of the biggest components of that are religious leaders. And yet, here today, you are saying, let's use these belligerent words. Let's use cold and capricious words and say, this is the way it has to be written. How do you respond on that?
You don't understand a blind word you're saying.
Clarify?
Well, neither does the president. He supports the Middle East policy, so don't feel bad.
Fair enough. Well,
Seemed like a waste of a question to me. Are you saying that because there are so many religious people, one should not speak what one feels about religion?
There are people who believe in God, myself included. And you were saying that those people are in this fringe group. We don't know what's going on. So if you're going to do that, what evidence, what proof are you bringing to the table? In the case of these words, the words you use, it's just fear. It's a fear component. That's not what the American people need right now. And I think Reverend Sharpton would agree with me on this.
Well, you're not claiming your book is therapeutic.
I'm sorry, your question is still gibberish. I'm terribly sorry.
Let's move on. Next question, sir.
Yes. Jeff from Washington, D.C. Reverend Sharpton, is it hypocritical of you to criticize the Latter-day Saints when you don't criticize your own faith?
I do criticize my own faith. I think that a lot of people that are in my own denomination has been very inactive, have been very apathetic, and in some cases outright cowards. But I still believe in my faith. Again, my religion is personal. My belief in God is personal. It's not based on any denomination. I can talk about the contradictions in people in my own denomination and in other denominations without it at all having to do with my faith unequivocally in a supreme being. One has nothing to do with the other.
Let's listen to something you said, Reverend Sharpton, before on the topic of the LDS Church. Let's listen.
And as for the one Mormon running for office, those that really believe in God will defeat him anyway. So don't worry about that. That's a temporary situation.
Those that really believe in God will defeat him. What did you mean?
I was really talking about Mr. Chris here had gone through this litany of what all religious people had done, and I believe religious people, for the large part, will be the majority of the voters according to polls anyway.
Right.
And that he'll be defeated. It won't be because of his denomination. It'll be by the same people that he thinks, meaning Chris, has no real good judgment in the world. But I went and met with the Mormons. I met with Elder Ballard. I met with others.
But you believe they really believe in God?
I believe they believe in God. They don't believe in God in the way I do, but neither does any other denomination. But I believe they believe in God.
If I could say a word, because it's largely my fault that Reverend Sharpton made that intervention, whereas you can see he was trying to be amusing. I mean, I had said, look, with George Romney, you have to ask this question, which people would decline to ask because they're embarrassed, because they don't want him to reply, are you questioning my faith? And the question would be this. Until the mid-1960s, the Mormon Church was an officially racist organization that, worse than the Ku Klux Klan, that openly said black people did not have souls, could not serve at the altar in its churches, were barely admitted to membership. They made the change just in time for the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which to me casts a real doubt on the sincerity of the revelation that they said made them make the change. I think it's high time Governor Romney was asked. I think it's a legitimate question, and I think he should be asked it by you and everyone else in the press when you do your candidate soirees next time.
The problem is that we've also been said to us in the media that if we begin to ask questions of deep religious belief like that, and that, of course, is social consequences, to say the least, could we have vetted John F. Kennedy on transubstantiation? Could we have vetted any Catholic on exorcism? How deep do you go in? How far do you
I think you could have done. Fortunately for President Kennedy, the Second Vatican Council was impending. So, for example, the Church was about to drop its charge that all Jews were responsible for the killing of Christ. Right. All Jews forever were indicted for deicide. Official anti-Semitism was just leaving church doctrine. If it had not, of course the president should be asked. George Romney was of the Mitt Romney, excuse me, and his father and grandfather. He's from a major dynasty in this church. They were of the age of reason when it was an officially racist organization.
No,
I want to hear them repudiate it.
I think a legitimate question.
Or stop saying that religion makes people behave more nicely.
I think a legitimate question of denominational leaders on issues is appropriate. I think to probe a candidate's personal religious beliefs, I think is something that's going over the line of their personal belief and their privacy. I think if you have a question on the doctrines of a church, you should ask the leaders of the church.
Next question.
Hi, this is for Mr. Hitchens. On the same debate where Reverend Sharpton got in trouble for saying that about the Mormons, you defended Stalinism by saying that Stalin would have been crazy not to have taken advantage of the situation where he was thrust into a place where he was over a group of people who were indoctrinated into religion. You said that he would be stupid not to abuse that power. I'm wondering how you could defend Stalinism.
Well, it wasn't a defense of Stalinism at all. I mean, I'm sorry if I think you are the only person who got that impression, if I may say so. That wouldn't make you wrong, of course, but I said it's an answer to the question that's often asked, what about secular tyranny? What about secular bullying and cruelty? Of which there's, of course, been a lot. And I said, well, very often it builds on religion. Russia, until the revolution, was led by a Tsar who was an absolute ruler of an enslaved people, and he was also the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. There were millions of people willing to believe that the leader of Russia should be in some way semi-divine. I said Stalin would be stupid if he didn't exploit this kind of credulity and servility that was already made for him to inherit from the era of servile Christianity. And I went on to say what I believe, which is if you want to have an argument on this, you have to point to a society that adopts the ideas of Jefferson and Thomas Paine and Spinoza and Einstein and Galileo that's fallen into tyranny before you can have a level playing field with the Inquisition, with slavery, with the Crusades and all the crimes of the religious.
Reverend Sharpton, it used to be when we were growing up. I'm a bit older than you, and as well as older than Christopher, but it seems to me back in the 1960 campaign, one could argue that religion had no place in politics, and John Kennedy was able to say, my religion's irrelevant, simply my patriotism should be the issue. And yet today you have the Roman Catholic Church through its bishops challenging the rights of Catholic office holders to take positions for abortion rights. They say you basically have to be for imprisonment of people involved with abortion, or else you're not a Catholic and you'll be excommunicated. It seems to be an era, not just because of Islam, where it's very hard to keep religion out of politics today, where and Mormonism was not even an issue with George Romney, the father.
Well,
now it's an issue with the son. What are we doing in this world that we keep bringing religion into the public political marketplace? Why does it keep happening?
More and more religious leaders and religious groups, when the fact that someone is a member of their group, are sensitive to, they don't want the beliefs and the dogmas of their groups misunderstood, or
why are
in
they
any way
foisting
misperceived.
themselves? Why are the religious leaders jumping into the political marketplace and saying to politically elected people who are duly elected, you cannot take that position and be in our church, or we will excommunicate you? That seems to be what's going on.
I think they would see it the reverse. I think they would say that if you're a public official and are telling people you're with us, we have the right to say, no, that is not what we preach, because we will be here longer than your term in office.
They have the right to say that. They're going beyond that, Reverend. They're telling them they can't have communion. They're telling them they cannot communicate with God. They're separating people from God.
Chris, but
I don't think you do agree with Christopher.
I don't agree with
a morally serious person should welcome excommunication from the Roman Catholic Church. What do they, by what right do they claim to lecture us on morality? Cardinal Bernard Law of Boston, who was found to have aided, facilitated, promoted and covered up the rape of children, is a refugee in the Vatican from the jurisdiction in which he should be standing trial. Let's hear from the church whether they can denounce that before they dare lecture us on morals.
Make a note that
before
he
they even
attacked the
dare.
Catholic Church. I did.
Before they dare.
Now he attacked Bernard Law, which is safer territory. Anyway, Reverend Al Sharpton and Christopher Hitchens are both coming with us. They'll be right back here on the hot Hardball Plaza. Harball, we're back with the Reverend Al Sharpton and author Christopher Hitchens at Hardball Plaza. It seems to me that you gentlemen may agree on something about God and religion and war, and that is that politicians use God for their own profane purposes.
I agree with that. I think that that is true. And I think that people should not confuse God with those that represent him or misrepresent him. And that's my only, my main disagreement with Mr. Hitchens in his book, God is Not Great. I've read it. It's well written, but I think that the premise is something I disagree with. God should not be confused with those that misrepresent him.
Since the time of Constantine in Hoc Signo Vincis, wars have been fought in the name of God. Is that why religion is bad, because it's been used by bad leaders?
Well, if it is true, and that was the premise of your first question too, then we make it easy for them by saying that we want to be told about faith, that we want to have a supernatural dictatorship, that we think that faith is to be revered rather than suspected. So if we are exploited, and if politicians exploit it, it's because we've asked for it. The thing is to get over that, outgrow the myth that the universe cares about us, that it was designed with us in mind, that it's all about you and me. It's not. Look at the beauties of science instead. Think about the constellations of philosophy, the glories of literature. Get a life. Get off your knees and stop groveling and stop wailing.
Well, the question for all of us is, when you ask a person to give their life for their country and to at least risk it in a very treacherous situation, a very dangerous situation like the war front, how do you do that without religion, Reverend?
I don't think you necessarily need religion, but you do need a belief in something more than just nice literature and science and philosophy. And I think that there's a purpose in life, and I think that connecting to that purpose is how people connect to God. Some need denomination, some don't. And I think that even in the highest levels of science, to me it only confirms what we don't know, and that there had to be a superior being that orchestrated all of this. I am not against science. I think science proves there's a God,
better not be.
Not disproves.
Do you have a religious objection, Christopher? We're almost done here. I'm sorry. Do you have a religious objection to anyone running for president right now? Objection to anyone's religious beliefs who's among the candidates? Anyone?
Not just for that reason, no. Your question.
No. Do you have a problem with Mitt Romney, for example?
Well, I have a problem with the racist cult organization of which he used to be a member. Yes, I want to hear him.
Would you hold that against him in voting for him or against him?
Certainly, of course I would. Yeah, I want to hear him give a clear answer. He hasn't yet, nor have you guys asked him. Your initial question, I don't want to be accused of ducking it. It's about to be the 4th of July. Your question insults all the brave Americans who fought for a secular constitution that separated church.
Because I ask questions and they don't insult anyone.
The assumption is that without the belief in God, they wouldn't have fought. This is not true of Thomas Thomas Paine.
Only God can figure out my assumptions.
It's not true of the. It's not true of those. It's not
if
true
there
of
is
those
no
who
God,
fought
you must
for,
not be God, right? So you can't tell.
Are you asking me or telling me?
No, you told me you knew my assumptions. I asked an open question.
The assumption was,
which is,
how
how
could
do you
people
ask a
fight for their
person to give
country
up their
without
life
God?
if there's nothing else?
Well, I'm the peacemaker here. You are not God. And I
the assumption was, how would people fight for their country without God? The answer is the American revolutionists who set up the first and only republic that separates church from state. I say, Mr. Jefferson, build up that wall. Happy 4th of July.
It separates us from a specific religion. Anyway, thank you very much to the Reverend Al Sharpton and Christopher Hitchens, author of God Is Not Great. For more on Hardball, my interview with actor Bruce Willis. See you then.